it's a really important point that as we try to, fill the void, we need to reimagine local news also to make it much more inclusive and better. Here she is. Here are the pieces she's done. Here are the pieces that literally would not have happened about your schools if we didn't do this. So help support us. And that's a much more compelling pitch.
Let's talk and get deep about what are the things that like normal Americans can do to help?
Well, I think three things. One is subscribe to a local something, local newspaper, or if it's a nonprofit, donate to it. That's the most important thing, because at the end of the day, you're not going to have good community journalism if the community doesn't support it. And, in a way, we all got used to kind of having a free ride on this because advertisers were basically paying for it all. And that's not true anymore. And we actually are going to have to, pay. And it's not that much money when you think about how much it costs for a subscription compared to how much you pay for coffee. And there is now this philanthropic sector where people are doing donations. So if you have the resources, donate also to nonprofit news organizations or places like Report for America or local versions of that. And then I think the third thing, which is a little less well developed, but it's coming, is public policy. Like there are some things that can be done in public policy ways, and people can support that. People can, communicate with their members of Congress saying, this is an important issue. We need to save local news if we're going to save democracy and if we're going to deal with issues like healthcare and climate change, stuff like that. And so it's honestly sort of in the early stages of people getting their hands around what kind of public policy things could you do that wouldn't make it worse and wouldn't have First Amendment problems, things like that. But there are some things you could do. I'll give you one example. There's a bill called the Local Journalism Sustainability Act. And it's a really clever bill. It provides a tax credit to consumers to help them buy subscriptions. So it essentially underwrites your subscription or a donation. It provides a tax credit to small businesses in a community that advertise in a local news something. And it provides a tax credit to local publishers to hire or retain journalists. And it's pretty clever because it doesn't involve a government agency sitting there deciding to give out grants in some subjective way based on articles they like. It's more universal than that. It's more objective factors. And an actual version of part of that was in the Build Back Better bill. It almost passed. And it might still pass if they ever get around to doing like a mini version that they're always talking about doing. It could be in that. And so we're working. My second hat, as you mentioned, is something called the Rebuild Local News Coalition, which pulled together all these different groups of big, little, nonprofit, for-profit, labor, publishers, unions, to try to get a couple things that can really help with that.
And that's like you're sort of acting as sort of a lobbying, representing those groups to try to enact policies?
Yeah. Yeah. And coordinating, they're also doing their own thing, but we kind of, it's a way of coordinating. We do our own lobbying and advocacy, and we sort of help coordinate all these other groups and get everyone sort of working in the same direction, focused on the same thing, so we have more impact.
So do you think the future of quality, real journalism is nonprofit?
I think nonprofit will play a much bigger role than it has in the past. But I think it could be a bunch of different models. Like, I'll give you an example. Report for America, we are a nonprofit, but we actually place journalists in both for-profit and nonprofit organizations. So, and the for-profits, it's kind of interesting to see how that works, because it's like a nonprofit, injection through this person who's working in a for-profit newsroom. And it basically kind of creates this hybrid, but it works really well. Like, it ends up that they're doing these beats that they weren't doing before, covering certain communities that had never been covered well before, or topics. And that's kind of an interesting model that makes me think you could have some versions where you've got the website that is doing restaurant, it basically has creamed off the parts of the business that work, like restaurant things that you can get advertised for that aren't that hard. And then the philanthropic sector is kind of underwriting the more labor intensive accountability beats. Like I could see some combos like that. And then in other places, there's some really cool, pure nonprofit things. In other places, you have the kind of billionaire owner model. That works sometimes if you've got a good billionaire.
Yeah, you're just betting that the billionaire is good.
Yeah, it's not really where you want to hang your whole democracy on, but there are definitely cases like at Minneapolis and Boston and Washington Post, weirdly enough, are cases where the benevolent billionaire has remained relatively benevolent, and those can work out well too.
I feel like local news has been declining for all this time, my whole life. And everyone's always just like, I don't know, business model. And no one ever comes up with a solution. So I feel like there's no real push for like telling philanthropists they need to put their largesse into local news. There's gun violence, climate change, a lot of these big issues. It feels like there's no real movement or push.
I totally agree. It drives me crazy, as I think you're right. I mean, there's exceptions. There's a half a dozen foundations that are doing amazing work in this space. So what I'm about to say doesn't apply to them. I'm still very grateful. But I'll give you an example. I just saw a list of the top 100 grants from foundations, democracy funders. These are things that are trying to strengthen democracy, right? So already you've narrowed it down to just democracy. Only one of the 100 was for a local news project. So that means the democracy funders are not even thinking that journalism is important for democracy. So that's like, oh my God, like if we're not
it's a
actually
short-term. They're focusing
so you're totally
on the short-term
right.
wins, on the short-term election.
Yeah, and it's kind of ironic. You work on having structurally sound elections, but then no one's voting because no one knows who the candidates are.
And I feel like there's an issue too, because a lot of people, it's like, I think a lot of people are like, local news was always about, if it bleeds, it leads anyway. So they're like, why I should support that. But like the idea is, I think if we can reimagine local news and actually create a nonprofit of local news, then you can actually create a case study where it's like, this is what you're paying for. You're not paying for like the cat was lost in the tree, like people envision of the old local news. Right.
Or in the worst case scenario that we saw is like all blacks are criminals. Like all black people are criminals, right? So you're totally right that we don't want to romanticize the golden age of local news because, there were lots of cases where, local news was either not really covering our community or covering them destructively, in some cases. So it's a really important point that as we try to, fill the void, we need to reimagine local news also, to make it much more inclusive and better. And I do think that having a much bigger role for the nonprofit model and sector can be a very positive thing for that reason, because you are looking at it that way. Like if it bleeds, it leads doesn't work if you're trying to make a case to donors. And by donors, I don't just mean rich people. Like donors can be a $10 donation from someone in the community, but it's kind of the same thing. Like they're not going to give for it bleeds, it leads either. They're going to give their $10 if they feel like you're covering the schools better. And so having that little extra philanthropic motivation to it, I think can pull the system in a better direction.
Maybe you could even fund beats, like the education beat, or fund.
Well, that's like the way. That's actually, interestingly, that's the way we do it at Report for America. It's all beat based, and what we find is that when they then go out to like pitch the community, help us support this Report for America position, they do it exactly the way you just said. Like it's not abstract save democracy. It's we have someone covering the schools now. Here she is. Here are the pieces she's done. Here are the pieces that literally would not have happened about your schools if we didn't do this. So help support us. And that's a much more compelling pitch than general "help us, the news organization, we're sad, we don't have enough money," or even the more abstract "save democracy," which is a little bit, it's true, but kind of vague.
Because it goes back to that national discussion where it's like I hate mainstream media, I hate this, and people say the media, and it means so many different things. Most of the time, they're talking about TV news. I don't like CNN, Fox, NBC, but they're not. They're talking about cable TV. They're talking about a particular opinion guy, and they're not really talking about what. So it's the conversation just gets derailed when actually they do want someone. Almost everyone wants someone covering the schools if you have kids, or covering, certain issues that you care about.
Yeah, that's a great point. And people really do, if you get them to pause for a second, people really do make a distinction in their minds. I mean, regular people between national and local, but it usually just gets all mixed together.